Good evening. Welcome to the Critical Hour. We are coming to you from the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist, Dr. Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, political analyst, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
For the next 2 hours, we will explore and analyze the salient news stories that are impacting the global village in which we live. Middle East Eye reports Turkey blocks start of talks on Sweden and Finland's NATO bids. Sources tell Middle East Eye that Turkey has blocked the negotiations that are due to start today over the two countries' alleged support of the PKK. What are we to make of this, and will Erdogan stick to his guns? For insight into this, let's turn to our first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His forthcoming book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas, Slavery, and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, Gerald, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So at a NATO ambassadorial level meeting yesterday in Brussels, Turkey voted against commencing the discussion regarding Finland and Sweden's bids to join NATO, citing its objection to the bid. Turkey accuses both countries of adopting a lax attitude towards the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK. Turkey, the U.S., and the EU have all designated the PKK as a terrorist organization. Dr. Horne, is this a position that you think Erdogan will stick to, or do you see him using this as leverage to extract his pound of flesh?
Most likely the latter. Keep in mind that Erdogan has a well-established record of playing a double game. Recall that on the one hand, Turkey has been hosting negotiation sessions between the Ukrainians and the Russians on the one hand, and on the other hand, Turkey has been supplying very effective drones to the Ukrainians, drones which you may recall helped to turn the tide of the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia in favor of the former. Indeed, I recommend to your audience a comprehensive article in a recent issue of The New Yorker detailing the effectiveness of this drone warfare. On the one hand, Turkey has been castigated by Washington for receiving Moscow's formidable S-400 anti-aircraft missile operation. That has caused many to say that Turkey perhaps even should be expelled from NATO. In fact, if you look at today's Wall Street Journal, the former Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, former vice presidential nominee under Al Gore, has an op-ed suggesting precisely that. And Turkey itself has not forgotten what happened in the summer of 2016 when Washington was credibly accused of sponsoring a military coup against Mr. Erdogan that barely failed. In fact, the coup plotters had Mr. Erdogan literally in the crosshairs, and he barely escaped assassination. But you also need to consider that just this week in Washington, D.C., you had the Prime Minister of Greece, Greece being the longtime eternal foe of Turkey. Recall that Greece won its most recent independence about 200 years ago in a bitter and brutal war against the Ottoman Turks, represented in the recent book by Columbia University's Mark Mazower. And the prime minister, speaking as Kamala Harris was seated behind him, along with Speaker Pelosi, denounced the Turks in no uncertain terms. And so it's unclear how this situation is going to shake out with regard to Turkey seeking to block the ascension to NATO of the Finns and the Swedes. But being a wily negotiator, I dare say that Mr. Erdogan will not walk away from the negotiating table unsatisfied or dissatisfied. And in fact, if you look at the remarks of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, he has poo-pooed the idea that the Finns and Swedes will be blocked. But keep in mind, it's not just the Turks who are upset with the ascension of the Finns and Swedes to NATO. Keep in mind that Croatia, which, as you know, has been close historically to Germany. In fact, they can attribute their recent independence to Germany's intervention in the Yugoslav conflict about 30 years ago. They are upset about this ascension because they claim that with regard to the peace agreement that led to the lessening of the siege on Bosnia and Herzegovina, that the strictures of those agreements have not been fulfilled, and that they will block the Finns and the Swedes until these strictures are basically observed. So there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and so it's unclear whether this recent move of the Finns and the Swedes to reverse decades, and in Swedes' case, centuries of neutrality and non-alignment will prevail. But I would dare say that the North Atlantic bloc has other problems to contemplate. For example, you might have seen the article in the Financial Times of London that suggested that the head of Volkswagen is very upset with this Russia policy of Chancellor Scholz in Berlin. Indeed, the neutral observers are suggesting that a boycott of Russian energy will have a devastating impact on the German economy, Volkswagen not least. And also, speaking of the Financial Times, you might have seen the op-ed by Anne-Marie Slaughter, a former State Department official under Obama, a former dean at Princeton, the head of a Washington think tank. You do not reach that level without being well-wired within the U.S. ruling elite. And she's raised searching and probing questions about the overall strategy of the North Atlantic bloc with regard to Russia. The same could be said for the Washington Post columnist Fareed Zakaria, who also, as you know, moonlights on CNN as a host of a program. He had an op-ed in the Washington Post just a few days ago that likewise raised searching and probing questions, in his case, about these asset seizures of Russian assets to the tune of hundreds of billions. According to Mr. Zakaria, this is raising doubts not only in New Delhi and Beijing about whether Washington will be able to do the same to their assets that might temporarily be housed in the United States of America, but even there are those in Brussels who are raising similar questions. And then we get to what I call the big enchilada. Mr. Biden, as we speak, is headed to Northeast Asia because he does not want his allies, particularly South Korea, to lose sight of the fact that China should remain in the crosshairs. And that, it seems to me, is the ultimate story with regard to this entire adventure, escapade in Ukraine. And to that end, I hope that Washington has paid attention to the fact that you had a very important meeting in Moscow just the other day between the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization headed by Russia, including former members of the Soviet Union, including Belarus and Kazakhstan, meeting jointly with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that has as a titular head China, that also includes Iran, and is viewed by certain analysts as sort of a lineal descendant of the old Warsaw Pact. And I dare say that on the agenda, although I'm not privy to the details of the agenda, was worry and concern about what Washington's plans are with regard to both Russia and China. And to that end, also pay attention to a meeting that took place in France the other day of the so-called Trade and Technology Council, an attempt to bring the United States and the EU together on a common platform as opposed to squabbling, which is their usual tendency. It's no secret that this Trade and Technology Council is trying to coordinate the hawkish U.S. policy towards Russia and towards China with a policy of France in particular that might not be on all fours with that hawkishness. And at the same time, the EU has to consider the policies of the erstwhile member of the European Union, speaking of Brexit London, where you have Prime Minister Boris Johnson being more hawkish than the hawks in Washington, but at the same time threatening to overthrow the Brexit pact because of difficulties in implementing that pact in Northern Ireland, part of the UK. But for the first time in recent decades, you now have the leader in Northern Ireland being the Sinn Féin party, which is tied loosely, at least, to the Irish Republican Army, which is hostile to the monarchy in London. So the North Atlantic bloc has many fissures and contradictions to contemplate. And sadly enough, I don't necessarily see contemplation of these fissures and contradictions being debated or even contemplated in the U.S. left.
It just came out today that Italy has proposed a peace plan for Ukraine. It was widely reported that Israel's leader, Mario Draghi, pretty much beseeched President Biden to come up with some kind of a diplomatic solution to Ukraine. It seems that the economic pain is rising to a point where in a parliament you have to be concerned that on any given day your government could be dissolved. How long can these governments hold out with the amount of economic pain that their people are going to be feeling?
Well, that is the $64 question, is it not? And if you consult your tapes, you'll find that early on in this conflict, I suggested that Italy would be peeled off first, primarily, not least because of the long-standing ties between Rome and Moscow, stretching back to the histrionic days of Silvio Berlusconi, Mr. Ooga Booga himself, known for his many sex scandals. But that's not the only problem, it seems to me, that the North Atlantic bloc faces. Already you see that Washington's trying to ease sanctions against Venezuela because you cannot have a capitalist world with sanctions against the major oil suppliers, speaking of Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. At the same time, you might have noticed that out of pocket in Washington this past week were not only Vice President Harris, but Secretary of State Blinken, Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin. They were all at the same site at the United Arab Emirates funeral for their recently departed leader, who is no longer in the land of the living. And that bespeaks the fact that the United States' relations with the UAE and its close friend Saudi Arabia have not been ideal. We've talked on this program about how the Saudis have refused the phone calls of Mr. Biden, and I think that helps to bespeak why Vice President Harris and her comrades were in the UAE. But it'll take more than a high-level delegation to heal that wound, because the United States, it seems to me, would be in its best interest to heal the wound with Iran in order to get Iranian oil back on the market. But the UAE and the Saudis are not necessarily in support of that maneuver. And at the same time, Washington has gotten a real black eye with regard to its support for the UAE and Saudi vicious genocidal attack on neighboring Yemen. And Washington feels that that is no longer sustainable. So there are so many problems with the North Atlantic bloc right now that it makes one wonder if they, in fact, are the bloc that's being sanctioned as opposed to those that are seeking to sanction.
RT reports Helsinki comments on hosting NATO bases or nukes. The prime minister says nuclear weapons are banned by law in Finland, and the Swedish Democratic Party is making it clear that while it supports seeking NATO membership, it would resist if asked to host foreign nuclear weapons or military bases. And one of the things that I've been taking away from some of President Putin's comments is, hey, Finland and Sweden, you can join NATO if you want to, but if you put nukes in your country, face in mind, you're going to have a serious problem on your hands. Dr. Horne.
Well, clearly Helsinki and Stockholm did not think through the consequences downstream of seeking to join NATO. Speaking of not thinking through the consequences, let me point you to the chairperson of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Washington, speaking of Congressional Black Caucus member Gregory Meeks of Queens, who has carried legislation that has passed the House 415-9 that would seek to punish African countries that are thought to be too close to Moscow. Now, we have reached a strange state of affairs when members of the Black misleadership class are now seeking to punish African nations at the same time that black people are being mowed down like flies in the streets of Buffalo and are in desperate need of international solidarity, African solidarity not least. So once again, you see Washington ensnared in a snarl of contradictions and fissures.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on